David Erickson has written a clear, convincing, and timely book that helps us move away from the relentless negative energy that for too long has surrounded affordable housing policy. The decentralized new network of nonprofit housing developers, bankers, state housing finance agencies, community partners, all these groups he describes, this new network is more robust, more successful, more stable, and ultimately a more viable system than previous state-centered policy approaches. The new network's, the irony here is the new network's complicated financing and complicated deal-making actually produces better results. It produces better human-scale affordable housing and commercial buildings that are more sensitive to their context and targeted to meet community needs. So in this kind of humble, low-key, almost invisible way, and he calls it invisible, the new networks have achieved levels of success that have eluded previous federal efforts, and often at lower cost. Before going any further, let me tell you my approach to these issues. I approach this as a policy historian, and in studying the debates over housing policy for the last 120 years, advocates throughout that period have always seen a housing crisis in the U.S. But over the course of the 20th century, the proportion of families in crisis has significantly declined. To the point where today, somewhere between 5 and 10%, depending on your definition, have what we'd call a housing problem. Most of the gains have been in housing condition due to our century's historically unprecedented economic growth, but the stubborn problems of affordability that remain in the 21st century require different kinds of state involvement than in the past. And the question is how state actors can be a positive force rather than a counterproductive one. So in my comments, I want to emphasize three concepts in the book that I think I found particularly convincing and particularly valuable. First, that past policy failure has been crucial in the emergence of the new network, and that, two, that the systemic learning that David kind of described, I'll call it learning, is the most important improvement over the old policy framework where learning was more haphazard. And third, that building state capacity, mostly at the local level, and not just nonprofit capacity, will be essential for the new network to have a truly lasting and far-reaching impact. So first, let me talk a little bit about the history. David is exactly right that affordable housing policy and housing spending has been more transformed than retrenched since the 1980s. I think that's a major contribution here. It would be easier in our short historical memory to say that the housing policy revolution was a response to the Reagan administration's policies, but David takes the story back to the 1960s and 70s and the rapid fluctuations in policy change in that 68 to 73 period. I might go even further back, being a historian, and point to the 1950s, when already there was disillusionment with public housing policy. In the early 60s, the backlash against urban renewal had begun. And those also were important historical contexts. But a thread connects each of the previous policy disappointments. And it's not just their general Washington top-down nature. Each, the public housing, urban renewal, you could talk OEO programs, perhaps model cities, each began with the assumption held by most progressives at the time that local city governments were too corrupt to trust, and that the federal government should go around them, should avoid them in implementing its policies. Thus, local elected officials could not take ownership of these programs, could not have a stake in them for their own political survival in the same way that these new networks do. In the case of public housing, local housing authorities were created as independent implementation agencies expected to be run by elites. The policy choices had the effect of angering elected local officials, leaving the programs politically vulnerable and isolated on multiple levels, and moreover dependent on HUD for money, which had its own political weaknesses in the 1970s. Finally, this policy structure meant that progress was often measured in narrow ways, most often in terms of number of units built. Resident community satisfaction were rarely measured. Okay, so this brings me to the second point about learning. Systemic learning in the new network that David describes. He's convincing that multiple partners and multiple eyes scrutinizing a project make the new network far less prone to some of the disastrous errors of the past. And I'm convinced of this in part because of my own work on Chicago public housing, where it took decades oftentimes for learning to take place. In 1955, and again I like to go back even further in the past, in 1955, the CHA had 3 years of experience with high-rise designs, and they knew they were not a good idea for families with children. And they came to Washington and said, can we build low-rise houses? But it wasn't until 1967 that HUD finally relented and changed its policy to allow alternatives to high-rises for large cities like Chicago. But by then, 10,000 apartments had been cast in concrete that would become albatrosses for the city of Chicago, much as the St. Louis example was for that city. Learning did not get adequately communicated, but more importantly, even when it was communicated, did not rapidly translate into policy change. And so is the new network, are all failures gone? Or we got this perfect? No, and I think David mentions that and accepts that. Is the feedback perfect? Of course not. Some of these new initiatives will fail. But that failure is less likely to be repeated and is less likely to be devastating. All right, third comment, and I'm not going over on time, am I? Please cut me off because I get excited. The third point is that state capacity is still going to be very important in this new network. While much effort has been directed at enhancing nonprofit capacity, the state is still the crucial partner, and so long as it lacks the capacity to foster, encourage, and support nonprofit actors, then affordable housing goals will suffer in many cities. And David pointed out that there are not cities that have these kind of terrific networks. He mentions Fresno, Las Vegas in the book as examples where these might be places where relatively inexpensive interventions to encourage state building capacity at the government level, as well as nonprofit capacity, would help. The question is, how far do you intervene without becoming, again, a more centralized policy? Still, the uneven capacity of cities is a cost of the decentralized housing policy that David describes. I can live with this a little bit because of the relative success of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Yes, that program has its problems, and we could have a conversation about that, but in part because of some of these same local capacity issues. But the greatest weakness of vouchers is that they don't create the kind of supportive housing that many of the nonprofits David describes do. And we now know, after decades of trial and error in some ways, that the supportive housing model works best for many low-income families who often need extensive social services on site. The nonprofits have figured this out. And for this reason, we need to continue to find new ways to foster both state and nonprofit capacity towards that end. All right, so finally, I want to wrap up with what are some of the implications here for both Treasury and HUD. And this is a little treacherous ground because, again, I'm a historian and I probably shouldn't step into current debates. Wait till things happen and then reflect, right? The Treasury stepped into the void created by HUD's political weakness in the 1980s. And as Erickson explains, David explains, the HUD Treasury became the most important affordable housing producer through the low-income housing tax credit. And he explains the institutional reasons for this, namely because Congress likes to do tax expenditures. But it also says a great deal about HUD's reinvention, HUD's image. While I'm not a marketing person, the legacy of the past failures is still long. And it's perhaps so strong that I would love to see HUD get a new name, start over, substantially reorganize, perhaps break into some of its constituent parts. And I recognize the political difficulty of this, particularly as the Treasury is also wrestling with its regulatory role and whether it should centralize some functions. But HUD could really help its image by embracing this network more openly, perhaps, without somehow smothering. A final comment, David has done us a great service in finding out what works, and it turns out to be rather non-ideological, perhaps kind of third way, perhaps Clintonian, perhaps even timely for an Obama administration that wants to transcend the old politics. This nonprofit community development model is the kind of success that can be built on in positive ways in the future as the past continues to recede from view. Thank you, David, for a terrific book.